Hello everyone, we're moving on to discuss the next type of a weakness, and this time it's going to be backward pawn. This is a position you're already familiar with, we saw it in the introduction clip, and for illustrative purposes I thought that we could very quickly go through this position once more and discuss a few additional issues. So as you could see, black has a backward pawn on d6, and this is going to be our main concern here. Potentially white, we could also talk about white having the backward pawn on f2, but this is not that relevant. What you need to understand is that backward pawn is usually weak because first it cannot move forward, so it is fixed to its current position. And second of all, there is no pawn that could potentially protect it. So the backward pawn requires being safeguarded by the pieces. So the d6 pawn is a classical backward pawn example. And what is also usually important to mention is that a backward pawn often protects another pawn, so it is a foundation to sometimes to even entire pawn structure. So here, as you can imagine, in case black loses the pawn on d6, automatically the pawn on e5 may become a target. Here, of course, the pawn on e5 will not become a backward pawn, so it's not that whenever you win a backward pawn, then another backward pawn is created. But in this particular situation, in fact, e5 becomes an isolated pawn, and as you already know, it might be subject to attack. More importantly, in case of a classical backward pawn example, so as here, there is also a weak square in front, exactly in front of the backward pawn. Here d5 is a perfect example of a weak spot for black and strong square for from white's perspective. So of course, as regards planning, what white would love to do is perhaps play rook a to d1. Black will most likely protect it with either of the rooks, probably rook f6. And then white might be interested in doubling up along the d file, so by playing rook d5, then automatically pawn on a5 is hit and pawn on d6 as well. And this is why d5 square becomes so attractive for white. In case the position was slightly modified and black could get to e6 with the king on time, so instead of placing the rook on f6, if the king was on e6, this d5 square would be extremely important, because with the king on e6, without the pawn on c4, the black would generally be interested in driving the white rook away. But since there is a pawn on c4 supporting the rook on d5, then such a rook becomes not only a very strong attacking piece, but also prevents black from improving his pawn structure. So that's a very important aspect, and keep that in mind whenever you're analyzing positions with backward pawn. Additionally, if black was able to play king e6 and drive the rook away, potentially to d2 or any other square along d file, then black could be interested in playing d5. I think you need to imagine that a little bit, because getting that position here would not be possible. But generally, this is the plan for the side playing with a backward pawn. So you generally don't want to have it. So you either try to exchange it for another pawn of your opponent's, or try to improve your pawn formation by moving the pawn forward. Coming back to white's ideas, after rook f6, as you see, the pawn on a5 is hit, and after b6, we mentioned in the introduction video, as I hope you remember, that b6 or b7 pawn is also a backward pawn, and here we have the same situation. So b5 is also a weak square, supported by the pawn on c4, so we see two clear cases of weak pawns and weak squares in front of those pawns. So in fact, white could be close to winning some material. He could try rook f to d1, and in case black plays passively rook d8, in fact there is some tactics here available, and you don't want to take on e5 with black because then you actually get checkmated in a few moves. And in case of rook e to e6, again very passive defense. Have a look how different the scope of the rooks highlighted in green and highlighted in red are. Basically the black rooks are tied down to defense of the d6 pawn, and white can just transfer his rook to attack the other pawn. And in fact black either loses the b6 or d5, and technically this position looks very bad for black. So of course that would be very dangerous for black. Of course, as you can already imagine, these defensive ideas that I presented for black are far from being optimal. Instead, black could perhaps be interested in getting some chaos on the board, so by means of a4, for example, so that after b takes a4, white's pawn formation is ruined. We have doubled pawns here, an isolated pawn here, so black can play rook c8, rook a8, and should generally get some play. Or alternatively, after b6, rook fd1, rook e to f8 could also be interesting. But it seems that white is just on time with rook 1 to d2, and there is nothing really going on after e4. There are no e3 ideas connected with attacking the white king. White just collects on d6, simplifies the position, and should be able to convert it. Okay, so this is all about the introduction for this moment. Keep in mind that usually in case of a backward pawn there is also a weak spot in front of it. And now we're going to move to a position taken from actual game. This is a classical example, a position from a very old game played between Forgach and Bernstein. Bernstein was definitely the better one of the two. I think he definitely belonged to the elite at that time. We're talking about early at the beginning of 20th century. This is the position where white is to move, and white correctly recaptured with the rook. Rook takes f4. In case of g takes f4, just to mention some strategy, g takes f4 results in white having a weak pawn on f4, and while black is generally not going to be interested in capturing this pawn, because after simplifications he loses the pawn on d6 and white will get a very dangerous d pawn. So this is what the line I'm mentioning here. Rook h4 is probably not the right plan, because in fact black takes a huge risk that he will actually lose both b7 and c5. White can start with rook d7, and I don't think rook d8, king f7, rook d7 is necessary, because that just improves the black king. So rook b6 or rook d7, maybe rook b6, followed by capturing on b7, and then c5 will also be weak. So potentially we will have 3 pawns of whites versus 2 pawns of blacks, and this should technically be winning. So that's way too risky for black. But still, after g takes f4, we see that the rook on f6 is active, while the one on f1 is passive. So that's generally not something white would be interested in. So instead, rook takes f4 was played, and I think this is the right decision. And after rook f7, rook d8, rook f8, rook f6, rook d8, rook e6, we finally get to the position that is going to be interesting for us. So in order to analyze this properly, we should definitely take a look at the weaknesses that both players have. So as you can already imagine, since we are talking about the backward pawn, there are backward pawns in this position. In fact, there is d6, there is also b3, and there is also b7. Out of these 3 pawns, I would say that only d6 is weak. b3, I don't really imagine a situation where b3 is going to be a weakness, because of the fact that black does not have sufficient resources to attack that pawn on b3. Because you need to imagine that the only scenario where black gets to attack the pawn on b3, not even talking about winning that pawn, but gets a chance to attack it, is where he leaves d8 or d7 square with the rook. And then of course white automatically takes on d6 and has enough time to put the rook on b6, where the pawn on b3 will be protected. Technically speaking, this is still a weak pawn, b3. So it fulfills the definition of a weakness because the backward pawn is generally considered to be weak. But in practice, this is not really a weakness because black cannot take advantage of it. So in other words, this is not weak. As regards b7 pawn, I could easily imagine this becoming weak. So if white is given another move, then his next move would probably be rook e7, hoping to see, so let's make some random move for black, h6, in case rook e7, if black plays passively, so for example rook b8, rook d7, and as you see the white rook is brilliantly positioned because it attacks both backward pawns at the same time. Of course this is not the end of the world for black, because in fact he can just play b5 actively, rook d6, takes, and after rook b4 it transpires that white is going to lose c4 pawn, and while white's position is a bit better because his rook is still going to be a bit more active, this should generally end up in a draw in my view. Still, black is just on time with consolidating. So he played king f7, and here we're going to introduce the first concept, which is more complex than just defining weaknesses. So you need to know that even though something might be weak, very often it is not enough for you to win it. So you can imagine that if you attack a weakness that you found in your opponent's position, he will also defend with the same number of resources. So if you attack the pawn with the rook, he will also bring the rook or king to protection of that weakness. And then you have one attacker, he has one defender. Remember that you always need more attackers than defenders to win something. So it's just impossible to win on that basis. And here this is such an example. Even though black has one weakness, the pawn on b7 cannot really be taken advantage of. White cannot really find a reasonable way of transferring the rook to a better spot. It could be b6, where the rook will be attacking b7 and d6 at the same time, but black still has just one defensive move, rook d7, and this is enough. Black is passive, but does well enough. So in the game there was h5, trying to provoke another weakness, and this is the principle of two weaknesses being introduced, and we will be talking about this in the following example, in the following video, and you will see that very often it is really needed to create a second weakness, so that by combining your attack on two objects at the same time, you actually get the chance to win some material because of your opponent's pieces being overloaded. So after h5, black of course does not want to allow h6, because h6 would either provoke isolated pawn on h7 or weak spot on f6, and this could potentially be used for penetration purposes later on with the white king. So black plays rook d7, king h3, h6 here would probably be not so strong. Well, black can still perhaps just take it, and after rook h6, king g7, he must have felt that this is sufficient here to defend. Although, to be honest, I would still try to opt for that from white's perspective. Also, I think that h6 from black's was a bit better, because then it should be generally be easier for black to defend a g pawn than h pawn. But probably white felt that this is not sufficient yet, and he tried to bring his king first, and and try to consolidate the pieces prior to defining the pawn structure on king side. Still, h6 exists as an idea, and I think this should be prevented actually. So there was king h3, and black plays b5, and this is a very important resource that black has. In case of c takes b5, and there will be rook b7, rook d6, rook b5, and black will generally hope to get some active play. In the game, white did not go for this continuation, but let's just mention c takes b5, and black either waits until white pushes as far as b7, but I think perhaps the intention was to play rook b7, rook d6, rook takes b5, and on rook c6 maybe even just play rook b3, rook c5, rook d3. And with such an active rook, this should be holdable. Of course, the rook on d3 also attacks the pawn on g3, so if black also gets a chance to simplify the pawn structure on king side, then he should generally be okay. That's why white should be interested in pushing h6 first, so that well, in such a manner that black will be forced to play g6. Then h7 pawn would become the second weakness. Without that, I think this position should not be holdable for black. And white assessed this position as not really promising, so he went king g4, b takes c4, b takes c4, and with this simplification continuation, black actually achieved well, something little but very important. He got rid of one of the weaknesses, and here actually both players have a backward pawn. Black has a backward pawn on d6, while white has a backward pawn on c4. And the only difference and what makes white's position better than black's is of course the rook's activity, and in fact king's activity as well. But the rook's activity here is the major factor, because with the rook being so passively positioned on e6, with the rook being so passively positioned on d7 and white's active rook on e6, black is unable to transfer the rook in such a way that c4 will be attacked in a good sequence. Black went king f8, and just to mention, if black plays rook b7 or rook a7, doesn't matter, white can take on d6, rook b4, and it seems that with either rook c6 or maybe even king f5, rook c4, rook d7, black is actually in some danger, because the pawn on d5 is much more advanced than the pawn on c5. White can play rook c7, following with d6 and d7, or d6, rook c8, d7 to be more precise. White can also play king e6 and support the passer with the king and also create some checkmate threats. So I believe this is going to be very tricky for black, if not already lost, to be honest. So black needs to stick to passive defense, but it transpires that this is just fine. King f8, king g5, now white is ready to push h6, king f7, king f5, the other idea is g4, g5, g6, and trying to get some sort of Zugzwang, and also penetrating to e6 with the king. But black is defending precisely enough, so he went h6, finally preventing all of this expansion on king side. So as I was mentioning, g4, g5, g6, driving the black king away from f7 spot. Then potentially, once the rook leaves the e6 square, maybe even playing king e6 if allowed. But this is a different story. Also, of course, white could be thinking about playing g4, g5 followed by h6, or h6 straight away. So black plays h6 finally. I think this should have been done earlier, but this is just on time. g4, rook d8, rook e2, rook f8. As you see, just basing on one weakness, white is not able to break through. Rook e6, king g8 check, king g6, rook f4. Finally black gets to play something active. Rook d8 would probably not be a good idea. Well, definitely not, because then Rook e7 just wins the g7 pawn and h6 and the game. So Rook f4 the only move. Of course, that required calculating the pawn endgame arising after Rook e8, Rook f8, takes, and g5. And after king e7 or king f7, king f5, doesn't really matter. King g6, king f8, h6. I think this would actually be lost for black, but black saves himself with a nice trick. King g8. On h takes g7, there is stalemate. On h7, black plays king h8, and he cannot play king f7 due to g5, and black is just first. So this is not enough. In case after rook f8, black went rook e7, and white would be even surprised with rook f6 checkmate. Okay, so after rook f4, rook e8, rook f8, rook e6, rook f4. Finally, there was g5, h takes, rook d6, threatening checkmate, g4, rook a6, g3, rook a3, g2, rook g3, rook f2, g4, and players agreed for a draw. And this in fact seems to be a draw. I don't think white is able to make any progress here. Black can just play king f8, and well, white will never be able to make any progress because his rook will be stuck to g4 or any square on g file, and trying to prevent further expansion, further movement of the pawn on g2, and so black has enough activity. So as you could see, backward pawn is generally a weakness. In case of this first example, we saw that there is often a weak square in front of the backward pawn, and there is also a risk of losing an entire pawn chain if you lose a backward pawn. In the second example, we saw that backward pawn requires a very passive defense in Rook Endgames, and fortunately for black, in this particular example, he had enough defensive resources, and also white did not manage to create a second weakness, which resulted in passive but sufficient defense. I hope you enjoyed this one, and thanks for watching.